The Baring family was, for over 2 centuries, the absolute embodiment of British financial power. They were an empire unto themselves, a dynasty of merchant bankers, founded in 1762 by Sir Francis Baring. Their bank, Baring's Bank, was so powerful that it was known as the sixth great power of Europe, standing alongside entire nations. Their vast fortune was built on the back of global trade, financing everything from government debts to colonial expansion. It was Barings that financed the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, effectively doubling the size of the United States. It was Barings that funded Britain's wars against Napoleon. Their wealth, estimated in the billions in today's terms, was preserved through generations of careful conservative management. But the Baring dynasty is not remembered for its centuries of dominance. It is remembered for its two catastrophic, generation-spanning collapses. The first in 1890 nearly bankrupted the entire city of London and required a massive bailout. The second, in 1995, saw the 233-year-old institution destroyed overnight, not by a war or a market crash, but by the secret, fraudulent trades of a single 28-year-old employee named Nick Leeson. The Baring story is a stark lesson in how centuries of power can be obliterated by a moment of unchecked arrogance. The origins of the Baring fortune. The Baring dynasty's foundation was built in the pragmatic 18th century world of the textile trade, a lucrative business deeply intertwined with the profits of human trafficking. The family patriarch was Johann Baring, a skilled wool merchant from Bremen, Germany. He emigrated to Exeter, a major center for the English wool trade, in 1717 to seek new opportunities. Despite being a foreigner, his diligence and skill allowed him to slowly build a successful business, integrating himself into the local merchant class. His son, John Baring, inherited and expanded this wool business, but it was John's son, Francis Baring, born in 1740, who possessed the vision and ruthlessness that would transform the family from simple merchants into global financiers. Francis Baring was a man of the new, modernizing 18th century world. He was educated, ambitious, and saw that the real money was not just in selling wool, but in financing the ships that moved it, the goods they brought back, and the governments that protected them. In 1762, he and his older brother John founded the John and Francis Baring Company in London. John was the cautious, conservative partner who provided stability. Francis was the brilliant, aggressive strategist who drove the expansion. The company began as a classic merchant house, trading in wool, cotton, and other commodities. But Francis quickly pushed the firm into the far more lucrative and far darker side of global trade, the Atlantic slave trade. This was not a peripheral part of their business. For a time, it was central to their wealth. Historical records and ledgers from the 18th century show the Baring Company acting as financiers, insurers, and agents for slave voyages. They were a key cog in the triangular trade. They would finance ships leaving British ports, like Liverpool, loaded with manufactured goods. These ships would sail to West Africa, where the goods were traded for enslaved human beings. The ships, now packed with captives, would endure the horrific Middle Passage to the Americas and the Caribbean, where the slaves were sold for cash and raw materials like sugar, cotton, and tobacco. These raw materials were then shipped back to Britain, generating a massive three-part profit for the financiers like Barings. Francis Baring's involvement was deep. He not only financed the voyages, but also acted as a consignee for slave-produced goods and was involved in underwriting the insurance on the slave ships and their human cargo. This was at the time a respectable, if morally debated, line of business, and it was immensely profitable. It provided the seed capital that fueled the Baring Company's first great expansion. But Francis Baring, like his contemporary Peter Widener in Philadelphia, also understood the ultimate source of wealth, war. The 18th century was a period of constant global conflict between the great European empires. These wars, like the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, which was raging just as his company was founded, were not just risks, they were opportunities. Wars are fought on credit, and nations need bankers. Francis Baring forged a crucial alliance with the Hope and Company Bank in Amsterdam. Hope and Company was, at the time, the most powerful merchant bank in the world. This alliance gave the fledgling Baring Company access to the deep capital reserves of the Dutch financial market. Together, they became key financiers for the British government. When Britain needed to raise staggering sums to fund its armies and navies, it turned to syndicates led by bankers like Francis Baring. This was the second pillar of his fortune. He became a master of government debt. He would underwrite massive issues of British government bonds, selling them to his network of wealthy clients and institutional investors across Europe via the Hope and Company connection. This business was not just profitable, it was safe as long as Britain won its wars, which it invariably did, and most importantly, it gave him immense political influence. He leveraged this influence directly. From 1784 to 1806, Sir Francis Baring, he was granted a baronetcy in 1793 for his services to the Crown, served as a member of Parliament. This was a blatant, though perfectly legal conflict of interest by modern standards. He was a politician who voted on matters of war, trade, and finance, while his private bank was the primary financial agent for the very government he was part of. He used his political access to gain insights, secure contracts, and shape policy to benefit his firm. His influence became so great that by the 1790s, during the wars against revolutionary France, he was the de facto banker to the British government. His firm managed the transfer of massive subsidies to Britain's European allies, a complex and lucrative business. He was, as one contemporary noted, the prime minister of the mercantile world. This concentration of political and financial power, built on the profits of slavery and war, led to the inevitable criticisms. He was, in the language of a later era, a robber baron, a man who had built a dynastic fortune by exploiting imperial conflict and human misery. His family, though German in origin, which brought some anti-German sentiment during periods of tension, had fully integrated into the British aristocracy through this calculated application of wealth and power. The family's internal dynamics were also strained by Francis's singular ambition. His older brother, John Baring, the quiet partner, grew increasingly uncomfortable with the firm's risky, high-stakes political finance. In 1802, John retired, dissolving the original partnership. Francis, now in total control, immediately reformed the company as Sir Francis Baring and Company, bringing in his own sons to secure the dynasty. Francis Baring died in 1810, leaving behind a colossal fortune and a financial institution that was second in power only to the Bank of England itself. He had successfully washed the origins of his wealth. The grubby profits from the Exeter wool trade and the horrific human cost of the slave voyages were obscured by his baronetcy, his seat in Parliament, and his patriotic role as the financier of Britain's wars. His sons, particularly Alexander Baring, would complete this transformation. Alexander, who would later become Lord Ashburton, was a financial prodigy. He was sent to America, where he cemented the firm's dominance in transatlantic finance. His greatest triumph came in 1803. Napoleon Bonaparte, needing cash for his European wars, had agreed to sell the entire Louisiana territory to the young United States, but he needed the money immediately. The U.S. government, under Thomas Jefferson, didn't have the cash. They needed a loan for $15 million, a staggering $375 million today. They turned to Barings Bank. Alexander Baring, in a masterpiece of financial engineering, brokered the entire deal. Barings, backed by Hope and Company, would essentially buy Louisiana from France and then resell it to the United States on credit. The bank bought $15 million in U.S. government bonds at a deep discount, paying about 87.5 cents on the dollar, paid Napoleon the cash, and then held or sold the bonds, profiting immensely from the interest and the eventual maturation at full value. It was the largest, most audacious financial deal of its time, and it was pure Baring, financing governments, managing massive risk, and operating on a global scale. This single deal cemented Barings' reputation as the preeminent global bank. It also furthered the cleansing of the family's image. Alexander Baring, the man who had doubled the size of America, was celebrated as a statesman. He later negotiated the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1842, which peacefully settled the border dispute between the U.S. and Canada in Maine. The Baring family, by the mid-19th century, were no longer seen as the descendants of slave traders. They were seen as the sixth power, the indispensable partners of empires, the very picture of aristocratic, old money respectability. But that entire edifice was built on a foundation laid by Sir Francis, a man who had mastered the Gilded Age arts of monopoly, political influence, and profiting from human suffering, a full century before the term robber baron was even coined. How does a banking superpower die? The foundation laid by Sir Francis Baring, built on war financing, political influence, and the morally flexible profits of 18th century trade, was transformed by his sons and grandsons into the most powerful private financial institution of the 19th century. Under the leadership of figures like Alexander Baring, Lord Ashburton, the bank's center of gravity shifted definitively from merchandise trading to the high-stakes world of international finance. Baring's bank became the sixth great power of Europe, not just because it was wealthy, but because it had become the indispensable financial intermediary for empires, governments, and the Industrial Revolution itself. Its business strategy was bold. It would use its vast capital and unrivaled reputation to underwrite the development of entire nations, reaping massive rewards by taking on risks that no other bank would dare touch. This strategy, however, contained a core, arrogant flaw: the belief that Barings was too big to fail. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 was the blueprint for this new imperial scale banking. The deal, brokered by Alexander Baring, was a masterpiece. Barings and their Dutch partners, Hope and Company, effectively acted as a sovereign power. They advanced the $15 million in cash to Napoleon, a leader with whom their own country, Britain, was frequently at war. They accepted payment from the fledgling United States in the form of U.S. government bonds, a risky asset at the time. The bank's profit came from the discount on these bonds, which they purchased at about 87.5 cents on the dollar, locking in a massive multi-million-dollar profit when the bonds matured. This deal demonstrated Baring's unique ability. They could straddle geopolitical conflicts, finance both sides, and leverage their reputation to turn high-risk government paper into a tradable, profitable asset. This government debt model became their specialty. They financed the British government through the Napoleonic Wars. They financed the French government after Napoleon's defeat, with the Duc de Richelieu famously stating that the stability of Europe depended on the Bank of England Barings, Hope, and Company. They funded the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the newly independent nations of Latin America. When a king needed an army or a new nation needed a railroad, they came to Barings. The bank's reach extended into the American industrial expansion. They were the primary European financiers for the Second Bank of the United States. They funded the canals and later the railroads that opened up the American West. Barings was the underwriter for companies like the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway in the 1880s, channeling vast sums of British capital into the project, taking their profit by selling the discounted railroad bonds to their network of investors back in London. By the 1880s, Barings was estimated to control a 20% share of the entire trade between Britain and America. They also became the masters of the initial public offering, IPO. In 1886, when the immensely profitable but privately held Guinness Brewery in Dublin decided to go public, they turned to Barings to manage the float on the London Stock Exchange. The offering was a spectacular success, massively oversubscribed, and it cemented Barings' reputation not just as a bond dealer, but as the premier underwriter for the world's biggest corporate names. By the 1870s, leadership of this global empire had passed to Edward Baring, the first Baron Revelstoke. Edward was the archetype of the aristocratic banker, supremely confident, socially impeccable, and possessed of an ambition that bordered on arrogance. He held court in the bank's opulent headquarters at 8 Bishopsgate in London, known simply as the Counting House, dictating financial terms to governments across the globe. He believed in a new aggressive strategy: find the next great emerging market, pour in capital, and corner the entire nation's development. His chosen target was Argentina. Argentina in the 1880s was the America of the future. Fueled by a massive boom in wheat, beef, and wool exports, its economy was exploding. Foreign capital, primarily British, was flooding in. The Argentine government, led by the ambitious president Miguel Juarez Kelman, was embarking on a massive debt-fueled modernization campaign, building railroads, ports, and grand Parisian-style boulevards in Buenos Aires. The 1880s in Argentina were the Década de Oro, the golden decade, and Lord Revelstoke, through Barings Bank, decided he would be its sole financier. Barings went all in. Between 1885 and 1890, the bank underwrote a staggering £140 million in Argentine bonds and securities. This represented an estimated 15% of all foreign capital in the country. Barings was not just an investor, it was the investor. The bank's name was on everything: railroads, utilities, port facilities, and massive drainage and waterworks projects for the city of Buenos Aires. The business model was the same as the Louisiana Purchase, but on an industrial scale and with a fatal new twist. Barings would buy massive tranches of Argentine government bonds at a deep discount. They would then sell these bonds at a higher price, but still at a discount to their face value, to their network of wealthy investors in London, pocketing a huge underwriting fee. This was high-risk, high-reward banking. The high interest rates on the bonds, often 6% or more, were incredibly attractive to British investors tired of low yields at home. The fatal twist was in the bank's own accounting. Barings was so confident in its ability to place these bonds that it began to carry massive amounts of unsold Argentine securities on its own books. It was, in effect, buying its own product. Furthermore, it was funding these long-term, illiquid assets by borrowing short-term money on the London interbank market. This created a classic catastrophic maturity mismatch. As long as the Argentine economy boomed and London investors kept buying the bonds, Lord Revelstoke looked like a genius. But if either of those things stopped, Barings would be instantly insolvent. For a time, the profits were astronomical. Barings was at the peak of its power, the undisputed sixth great power. But Revelstoke, in his arrogance, had made two fundamental errors. He had bet his family's entire 128-year-old bank on the stability of a single volatile emerging market, and he had violated the first rule of banking. He had confused his own ability to sell an asset with the asset's actual underlying value. The House of Cards collapsed in 1890. The crisis began in Buenos Aires. The Argentine government, led by the corrupt and reckless Selman administration, had been printing money, the peso moneda nacional, to finance its spending. Inflation exploded, hitting 1,000% by some estimates. Simultaneously, a political crisis known as the Revolución del Parque erupted, a violent but failed coup attempt that shattered public confidence. The Argentine economy, which was little more than a debt-fueled bubble, burst. Suddenly, the government had no way to pay the interest on its massive foreign debts. Argentina was about to default. The news hit London like a cannonball. The wealthy British investors who held Argentine bonds with the Barings name on them, panicked. They all tried to sell at once. The market for Argentine securities instantly vanished. There were no buyers at any price, and Lord Revelstoke, at 8 Bishopsgate, was left holding the bag. Barings Bank was suddenly sitting on £21 million, the equivalent of over $3 billion today, of utterly worthless Argentine bonds that it could not sell. But the short-term loans it had used to buy those bonds were still due. Barings was in a single stroke insolvent. It could not pay its bills. The news that Barings, the Bank of Empires, the sixth power, was about to fail triggered the Panic of 1890. A failure of this magnitude would not be contained. It would set off a domino effect, taking down every other bank in London and potentially triggering a global depression. The entire financial system of the British Empire was on the brink of collapse. In this moment of crisis, one man stepped in, William Lidderdale, the governor of the Bank of England. Lidderdale knew he had to act, but the Bank of England at that time did not have the legal authority or the capital to simply bail Barings out. He had to invent the modern bailout on the fly. He immediately went cap in hand to the one man in London whose power and wealth rivaled and perhaps exceeded Barings, Lord Rothschild. Lidderdale and the Rothschilds organized a secret emergency consortium. They convened a meeting of the city's top bankers, including firms like Anthony Gibbs and Sons. The atmosphere was funereal. Lidderdale laid out the stark truth. Barings was dead. If they did not act together to guarantee its debts, they would all be dead by the end of the week. Driven by sheer self-preservation, the consortium agreed. They assembled a rescue fund of £17 million, a colossal sum to guarantee Barings' liabilities and prevent a systemic collapse. The Bank of England led the way, but it was the collective power of the city, marshaled by the Rothschilds, that saved the day. The bailout worked, the panic was contained, the financial system was saved, but Barings Bank was finished. Lord Revelstoke was personally and publicly humiliated. He was forced to turn over his personal fortune, his grand estates, and his title to the bailout consortium. He died a few years later, in 1897, a broken and indebted man. The Baring family, after 128 years, had lost control of their own bank. The firm was forcibly restructured in 1890. It was converted from a private partnership into a limited liability company, Baring Brothers and Company, Limited. The Baring family was allowed to remain involved in the management, but their autocratic imperial power was gone. The bank was now a smaller, more cautious entity, its reputation shattered. The Panic of 1890 became a defining lesson in systemic risk. It was the first modern example of a too-big-to-fail institution whose failure threatened the entire global economy. It directly led to a strengthening of the Bank of England's role as a lender of last resort and influenced the thinking of American bankers who 2 decades later would use the crisis as a case study when designing their own central bank, the U.S. Federal Reserve. The Baring dynasty, however, had survived, but only just. They had been humbled, their arrogance checked by a brutal market reality. The bank spent the next several decades slowly, painfully rebuilding its fortune and its reputation. The new generation of Barings, chastened by their father's failure, adopted a new, far more conservative and boring approach to banking. They focused on corporate finance, asset management, and advisory work, carefully avoiding the high-risk emerging market gambles that had almost destroyed them. This new, cautious Barings reestablished itself as a respected, if no longer dominant, force in London finance. The bank successfully navigated the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the decline of the British Empire. By the 1980s, the Baring family, now led by Peter Baring, a direct descendant of the founder, was once again overseeing a highly profitable and stable institution. But the Baring dynasty, it seemed, had a generational blind spot. Their 19th century ancestors had been destroyed by arrogance, over-concentration in a single risky market, Argentina, and a catastrophic failure of internal controls. Lord Revelstoke had been allowed with no oversight to gamble the entire firm's capital on his personal conviction. In the 1980s, the bank, seeking new profits in the go-go era of deregulation, decided to expand into a new, complex, and high-risk emerging market, derivatives trading in Asia. They bought a brokerage house, Henderson Crosthwaite, in 1984, to gain a seat on the London Stock Exchange, and they opened a new futures trading office in a booming, far-flung financial center, Singapore. In 1992, the bank sent a young, ambitious, and seemingly brilliant 28-year-old trader named Nick Leeson to Singapore to run the new Barings Futures office. And in a stunning, almost unbelievable echo of history, they gave him total control. Leeson was not just the head trader, he was also, in a catastrophic breach of the most basic banking rule, in charge of his own settlement and accounting. He was the poacher and the gamekeeper. The Baring family, having survived the 1890 panic, had meticulously rebuilt their fortress, and they had just once again handed the keys to a single, unsupervised man in a high-risk market they did not understand on the other side of the world. The stage was set for the second and final collapse. The rogue trader and the secret 88888 account. The Panic of 1890 was the defining trauma of the Baring dynasty. It was a corporate near-death experience that had humbled the sixth great power of Europe, stripped its leader, Lord Revelstoke, of his fortune, and forced the family to cede absolute control. The lesson was brutal. Arrogance, high-risk emerging markets, and a catastrophic failure of internal controls could destroy them. In response, the new Baring Brothers and Company Limited, rebuilt from the ashes, was a different kind of bank. For the next century, it operated on a culture of ingrained, almost tedious conservatism. The Baring family members who ran the bank in the 20th century, culminating in Peter Baring, a direct descendant of the founder, Sir Francis, in the 1990s, were not swaggering traction kings or imperial gamblers. They were quiet, aristocratic, old money gentlemen. They specialized in the safe, respectable, and somewhat boring businesses of corporate finance, asset management, and advising the wealthy, including their most prized client, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The bank was deliberately small, exclusive, and they believed safe. But in the go-go 1980s, this conservative model was falling behind. The Big Bang deregulation of the London Stock Exchange had unleashed a new, aggressive world of high-speed, high-profit trading. Rivals were making fortunes in complex new products called derivatives. Barings, feeling the pressure to keep up, decided to dip its toe into this new high-tech emerging market. Their chosen arena was Asia, specifically the booming financial centers of Singapore and Tokyo. In the late 1980s, Barings began building a new modern division, Barings Securities. This was not the old wood-paneled counting house. This was the new Barings, staffed by young, aggressive barrow boy traders, a culture clash of new money energy within an old money institution. In 1992, to run a key part of this new operation on the Singapore International Monetary Exchange, CIMEX, the bank sent a 28-year-old man named Nick Leeson. Leeson was the living embodiment of the new Barings, and he was the perfect vector for the family's old recurring disease. He was not an aristocrat, he was a working-class kid from Watford, a plasterer's son who had not gone to Eton or Oxford. He had joined Barings in the back office, the unglamorous settlements department that processed the paperwork after the trades were done. He was ambitious, sharp, and desperate to get out of the back office and onto the trading floor, where the real money and glory were. His move to Singapore was his golden opportunity. His official job was to run a supposedly boring, risk-free operation, arbitrage. This was, on paper, the safest business imaginable. The Nikkei 225, Japan's main stock index, traded as a future on two different exchanges simultaneously. The Osaka Securities Exchange, OSE, in Japan, and the SIMEX in Singapore. Because the two markets were separate, a tiny price difference would often appear. A future contract might be, for a few seconds, a fraction of a point cheaper in Singapore than in Osaka. Leeson's job was to act as a high-speed shuttle. He would simultaneously buy the contract at the low price in one market and sell it at the high price in the other, pocketing the tiny, risk-free difference. This was not gambling. It was a simple, high-volume plumbing operation designed to make a steady, predictable profit. The Baring family and the London board, led by Peter Baring, loved this. It fit their conservative model. It produced millions in consistent, risk-free profits that padded the bank's bottom line and, crucially, their own substantial annual bonuses. But from the very beginning, the operation was built on a catastrophic failure, an echo of the 1890 crisis, so perfect it borders on the absurd. The 1890 collapse was caused by a failure of internal controls. Lord Revelstoke, the head of the bank, had been allowed to gamble the firm's entire capital on Argentina with no oversight. In 1992, the Baring board made the exact same mistake. They gave Nick Leeson total control. In a stunning breach of the most fundamental rule of banking, Leeson was made both the head trader and the head of the back office. He was the man making the trades, and he was also the man responsible for settling those trades and reporting the profits and losses to London. He was the poacher and the gamekeeper. He was his own auditor. This arrangement, which no modern bank would ever permit, was allegedly made for a simple aristocratic reason. The gentlemen bankers in London, like Peter Baring, looked down on the back office. Settlements was grubby, detailed work, not for people like us. It was easier to just let the barrow boy in Singapore handle all the messy paperwork himself. This catastrophic structure gave Leeson the keys to the kingdom, and it gave him the power to hide his first small mistake. The trading itself was complex. To execute his risk-free arbitrage, Leeson had a team of traders on the floor. Sometimes in the chaos of the trading pit, they would make an error, buying when they should have sold, or executing an order for the wrong client. These small daily errors were normal. In any other bank, they would be reported, reconciled, and the small loss would be accepted by the bank. But Leeson was not just a trader. He was a star. He was the working-class kid making millions for the aristocrats. He could not, he felt, admit to mistakes. He couldn't report these small, embarrassing losses. So he opened a new account. He used his back-office authority to open a secret, unaudited suspense account to temporarily house these errors. He numbered it 88,888, a lucky number in Chinese culture. The 5/8 account was born. At first, it was just a file drawer for small mistakes, which Leeson intended to clear out later with profits from other trades. But in late 1992, a much larger, more significant loss occurred. A new, inexperienced trader on his team made a major error, accidentally selling Nikkei futures when she should have bought. It resulted in a £20,000 loss. This was still a tiny sum for Barings, but it was too big for Leeson to fix quietly. He was terrified of the humiliation, of telling the London board that his risk-free operation had lost money, so he didn't. He simply transferred the £20,000 loss into the 88888 account. He hid it. This was the moment of transformation. The 88888 account was no longer an error account. It was a secret fraud account. And Leeson, the star trader, was now a criminal, secretly in the hole. Now he had to get that £20,000 back. He began to gamble. He started using the 88888 account to make his own proprietary trades, separate from the risk-free arbitrage. He would make small directional bets on the Nikkei 225, hoping to win back the £20,000 and zero out the account. But Leeson, it turned out, was a terrible gambler. His small bets lost. The £20,000 hole became a £50,000 hole. He doubled down. That loss became a £100,000 loss. He doubled down again. By the end of 1993, the secret 88888 account was hiding not £20,000 but £2 million in hidden losses. A normal person might have confessed, but Leeson was trapped in a psychological spiral. He was now a superstar. His official arbitrage business was generating millions in real profits, but his secret gambling was creating a parallel and much larger loss. He couldn't confess without destroying his entire life. So he did the opposite. He didn't just hide the loss, he began to manufacture fake profits to conceal it. His fraud became breathtakingly bold. He began to invent trades out of thin air. He would report a fictional, highly profitable trade to London, booking a huge fake profit on his official books. This made him look even more like a genius to the London board. Peter Baring and the executive committee, seeing these massive profits, awarded him a £130,000 bonus for 1993. He was being celebrated as a hero for profits that did not exist. But this created a massive cash flow problem. His real secret losses in the 88888 account were not just numbers on a screen. They were real debts. When you lose on a futures contract, you must pay a margin call in cash to the exchange every single day. The Cymex exchange was now demanding millions of pounds from Barings to cover the losses in the 88888 account. How could Leeson pay for his real losses while his bosses only saw his fake profits? He used his dual-hatted power. He told the London headquarters that his fake, high-profit trades required a large amount of margin from the bank. This was a plausible lie, London, wanting to fund their star trader, began to wire hundreds of millions of pounds to Baring's Futures in Singapore. Leeson was running a classic Ponzi scheme. He was taking legitimate money from his bosses in London, telling them it was to fund new profits, and was secretly using it to pay the ever-growing margin calls on his secret losses. He was, as one analyst later said, robbing the bank from the inside to pay the exchange. By late 1994, the whole had become a monster. The £2 million loss had ballooned to £200 million. Leeson was no longer just a small-time gambler. He was a desperate addict, making bigger and bigger bets, hoping for one miracle trade that would wipe the slate clean. He had abandoned all pretense of arbitrage. He was now making a single, colossal, one-way bet that the Nikkei 225 would rise. He was long the Nikkei, holding tens of thousands of contracts, all hidden in the 88888 account. He was essentially betting the entire future of Baring's Bank on the Japanese stock market. The arrogance and negligence of the London board during this period was absolute. They were, just like their ancestors in 1890, guilty of a catastrophic failure of oversight. The warning signs were everywhere, flashing bright red. The most glaring was the cash. The bank's entire treasury was being drained by Singapore. Barings was sending hundreds of millions of pounds to Leeson, more money than the entire bank's reported capital, supposedly to fund margin for his trades. But his trades were allegedly risk-free arbitrage. Risk-free arbitrage does not consume hundreds of millions in capital. It generates it. Auditors and executives repeatedly questioned this. Why did Leeson need so much money? Leeson, now a master liar, forged documents. He faked letters from clients. He created fake trade confirmations. He told his bosses that the money was for a secret, highly profitable, and totally fictional client. The Barings board, including Peter Baring, chose to believe him. Why? Because Nick Leeson's profits now accounted for an enormous percentage of the bank's entire bottom line. The 1994 executive bonuses, which were massive, were funded almost entirely by Leeson's faked success. To investigate Leeson too closely, to ask the hard questions, would mean risking the end of the party. They were, just like Lord Revelstoke a century earlier, so blinded by the profits that they refused to look at the risk. Peter Baring, the patrician chairman, famously never even spoke to Leeson directly. He was the barrow boy, making them all rich, and gentlemen did not meddle in the details. By January 1995, Leeson was cornered. His secret losses were in the hundreds of millions. He needed the Nikkei to rise and rise fast. On January 17, 1995, he got the opposite. At 5:46 a.m., the Great Henshin earthquake struck Kobe, Japan. It was a 6.9 magnitude quake that devastated the port city, killing over 6,400 people and shattering the Japanese economy. The Nikkei 225, the market Leeson was betting on, went into an immediate catastrophic freefall. For Nick Leeson, this was the apocalypse. Every point the Nikkei dropped, his secret losses in the 88888 account exploded by millions. He was now facing margin calls that were larger than the entire net worth of Baring's Bank. A rational man would have confessed. A rational man would have cut his losses. But Leeson was no longer rational. He was a desperate addict, convinced he could still win. He did not sell. He doubled down. In the final desperate days of January and February 1995, Nick Leeson, with the last of the money he was draining from London, began to buy Nikkei futures. He bought them by the tens of thousands. He was, in a final act of psychotic hubris, a single 28-year-old man in a Singapore office, trying to single-handedly prop up the entire Tokyo Stock Exchange against the weight of a natural disaster. He bought, and the market kept falling. He bought more, and it fell further. By late February, the game was over. The Cymex exchange, realizing the Barings account was now a black hole of unimaginable depth, demanded a final massive margin call that Leeson simply could not pay. The money from London had finally run out. On February 23, 1995, Nick Leeson wrote a simple note on a yellow sticky pad, left it on his desk, and walked out of his office. It read, "I'm sorry." He and his wife Lisa went to the airport and boarded a flight to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. He was a fugitive. Back in London, the alarms were finally, belatedly sounding. The executives in London, including Peter Baring, finally realized their star trader was gone, and the bank was facing a liquidity crisis. They sent a team of auditors to Singapore to figure out what was happening. The auditors went to Leeson's empty desk. They accessed his computer, and, for the first time, they opened the file for account 88,888. The Baring family and the entire banking world had just entered the abyss. The account was not a small error file. It was a ledger of doom. The total accumulated hidden loss was not £2 million or £200 million. It was £827 million, approximately $1.4 billion at the time. The loss was more than twice the entire value of Baring's Bank. The bank's total capital was only £375 million. The 233-year-old institution, the Bank of Queen Elizabeth II, the bank that had funded the Louisiana Purchase, the sixth great power of Europe that had survived the 1890 panic, was insolvent. It was, in a single weekend, completely and irredeemably bankrupt. A frantic, weekend-long rescue attempt was launched by the Bank of England. Just as William Lidderdale had done in 1890, the current governor, Eddie George, tried to assemble a lifeboat consortium of British banks to save Barings. But this was not 1890. The world was different. The other banks, upon looking at the scale of the derivatives black hole Leeson had created, refused. The risk was unquantifiable. They would not step in. On Sunday, February 26, 1995, the Bank of England announced that Barings Bank was bust. It was over. The Baring family was publicly and totally humiliated. Peter Baring, the aristocratic chairman who had overseen this catastrophic failure of management, was forced to resign in disgrace. He became a national symbol of aristocratic incompetence. The 1,200 employees of the bank, many of whom had their life savings invested in its stock, lost everything. Their bonuses, which had been celebrated just weeks before, and which were based on Leeson's fake profits, were gone. The 233-year-old bank was sold, not to a consortium of saviors, but to the Dutch banking group ING for the humiliating symbolic price of £1. Nick Leeson himself was arrested days later, trying to board a flight in Frankfurt, Germany. He was extradited back to Singapore, where he pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 6.5 years in the notoriously harsh Changi prison. While incarcerated, he was diagnosed with colon cancer, which he survived. He was released early in 1999 for good behavior. The final verdict on the 1995 collapse was a mirror image of the 1890 crisis. It was not, in the end, about one rogue trader. It was about the failure of the Baring family and its leadership. The official Board of Banking Supervision report was a scathing indictment of the London board. It cited a total failure of management and internal controls, a management which was unable to understand the business it was in, and an aristocratic arrogance that had allowed a single unsupervised employee to gamble away a 233-year-old legacy. The Baring dynasty, which had survived Napoleon, the 1890 panic, and 2 world wars, had been destroyed by its own repeated generational flaw, an arrogance so profound that it refused to check the details, a failure that was, in the end, indistinguishable from incompetence. The end of the dynasty and the final verdict. The February 1995 collapse of Barings Bank was not just a financial event. It was the final pathetic end of a 233-year-old dynasty. The £827 million black hole, discovered in Nick Leeson's secret 5/8 account, had not just bankrupted the Queen's Bank. It had vaporized the Baring family's entire legacy, leaving behind a smoking crater of public humiliation, legal investigations, and bitter recriminations. The sixth great power of Europe, which had survived the Napoleonic Wars and the 1890 Argentine panic, had been definitively and irreversibly destroyed by a 28-year-old derivatives trader and a catastrophic generational failure of the family that bore its name. The immediate personal tragedy of the collapse was not confined to the Baring family. It was shared by the bank's 1,200 employees. They, more than anyone, were the true victims of the family's negligence. Just weeks before the collapse, they had been celebrating a record-breaking year, largely built on Leeson's fictional profits. They were awaiting a £100 million bonus pool. But on February 26th, they woke up to find that not only were their jobs gone, but their bonuses were non-existent. And for many who had invested in company stock, their life savings had been wiped out. The public fury, therefore, was not just directed at Nick Leeson, the rogue trader, but at the man at the top, the bank's chairman, Peter Baring. Peter Baring, a direct descendant of the founder, was the living embodiment of the old money aristocracy that had run the bank for 2 centuries. He was the man who in 1994 had infamously dismissed the high-risk, high-reward culture of rival banks by stating that Barings preferred to be boring. He was also the man who, when the scale of Leeson's fraud was revealed, reportedly expressed astonishment that one man could cause such damage. His lack of oversight became a national scandal. The official Bank of England report, released in July 1995, was a scathing indictment, not of Leeson, but of the Barings management. It described a total failure of management and internal controls from the top down. It detailed how Peter Baring and his board had been unable to understand the business Leeson was conducting. They had ignored repeated flashing red lights, Leeson's unbelievable profits, the hundreds of millions of pounds in cash being funneled to him from London without question, and, most damningly, the catastrophic structural flaw of allowing him to be both the trader and the man who settled his own trades. Peter Baring was forced to resign in total disgrace. The family's control, which they had managed to retain after the 1890 crisis, was now gone forever. The bank, its name, its history, and its assets were sold for the symbolic price of £1 to the Dutch firm ING. The Baring dynasty was over. The internal family disintegration was immediate. Unlike the 1890 crisis, where Lord Revelstoke, the patriarch, was forced to use his personal fortune to cover the bank's losses, the 1995 collapse was a failure of a limited liability company. Peter Baring and the other family directors were shielded from personal bankruptcy. They were publicly humiliated, but they remained personally wealthy. This fact created immense bitterness among the thousands of employees who had lost everything. The Baring family, which had once commanded the attention of kings and presidents, retreated into the shadows. They scattered, their central source of power and identity gone. The Great Baring name was no longer a symbol of trust. It was a punchline, a case study in corporate incompetence. The only significant entity to survive was the Baring Foundation, the family's philanthropic arm, which had been legally and financially separated from the bank years earlier. It continued its mission of funding social justice and arts programs, a quiet, surviving echo of a fallen empire. This final pathetic collapse left a vacuum that was immediately filled with conspiracy theories. The official story, that a single working-class kid from Watford had single-handedly fooled one of the world's most ancient banks, seemed to many too simple. It felt like a cover-up. Financial blogs and London tabloids in the 1990s lit up with alternative narratives. Leeson, some claimed, could not possibly have acted alone. He must have been a patsy, a designated fall guy, covering up a much larger, more systemic fraud involving senior executives on the London board. Why else would they have ignored such obvious warning signs? Why would they have fed him hundreds of millions of pounds? This theory argued that the London board knew Leeson was gambling. They were simply addicted to the profits he was generating for their bonuses. And when the bet finally went wrong, they threw him to the wolves. Other theories were more geopolitical. Leeson, it was rumored, was not just a traitor. He was a pawn in a game played by larger, more sinister forces. Perhaps a rival bank or a predatory speculator like George Soros or even Rupert Murdoch had run the stops on Leeson, intentionally driving the Nikkei down to break Barings and pick up its assets for pennies. These theories, like all conspiracies, provided a more satisfying narrative than the simple, banal truth. The bank had been destroyed by its own staggering incompetence. This tendency to see conspiracies in Baring's failures was not new. It had happened a century earlier, during the 1890 panic. When the Bank of England, led by William Lidderdale, had turned to Lord Rothschild to help assemble the rescue consortium, it had spawned its own dark mythology. Anti-Semitic pamphlets and rumors in the 1890s claimed that the crisis was a Rothschild plot, a Jewish conspiracy to save their rivals at Barings, only to gain financial control over them. This, too, ignored the reality. The Rothschilds had stepped in, alongside other Protestant-run banks, out of pure, cold-blooded self-preservation to save the entire London financial system from collapsing. But the real Baring legacy is not found in these conspiracies. The family's true, tangible global influence was never a secret. It was open, celebrated, and written into the pages of history. The soft power of Barings was, for 200 years, the engine of the British Empire. It was not a conspiracy, it was policy. It was Barings, alongside the Rothschilds, that financed Britain's war against Napoleon. It was Barings that financed the Louisiana Purchase for the United States. It was Barings that funded the canals, the bridges, and the railroads that built North America, including the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. And it was Barings that had financed the nation of Argentina, binding it to Britain in a relationship of financial colonialism. The bank's power was not hidden in shadows. It was proudly displayed on the stock exchanges and in the government records of dozens of nations. The family's philanthropic legacy, the Baring Foundation, also continues to wield real-world influence. It remains a powerful force in British civil society, funding social justice initiatives, supporting the arts, and working on climate change, a quiet testament to the respectable side of the family's vast historical wealth. But the most significant and most ironic legacy of the Baring dynasty is one of failure. The family's two great collapses in 1890 and 1995 were so total, so systemic, that they became the primary catalyst for the creation of the modern financial regulatory system. The 1890 Bering crisis became the textbook example of systemic risk. It was the first time a too-big-to-fail private bank had threatened the entire global economy. The ad hoc rescue, organized by the Bank of England, set the precedent for all future central bank bailouts. It was a core case study for the bankers, who 2 decades later would design the U.S. Federal Reserve, creating a formal lender of last resort specifically to prevent such panics. The 1995 Lehman collapse was even more influential. It was a nuclear bomb dropped on the modern financial system. It was the first terrifying proof of the dangers of a new, unregulated world of derivatives. The Bering-Lehman scandal became the #1 case study at every business school and regulatory agency in the world, demonstrating the concept of operational risk. The disaster led directly to sweeping global reforms, including the Basel II Accords, which for the first time forced banks to hold capital reserves not just against market risk, like a bad bet on Argentina, but also against internal risk, like a rogue trader, failed audits, or a corrupt management. The entire modern system of internal bank controls, the sacred non-negotiable wall separating the front office trading from the back office settlements, was built on the ashes of Baring's Bank. This is the final verdict on the Bering dynasty. They were not victims of conspiracies. They were victims of their own generational arrogance. The family's story is a perfect tragic loop. In 1890, they were destroyed by Lord Revelstoke, an aristocrat who believed he was too smart to fail, who gambled the entire bank on a single high-risk emerging market. A century later, in 1995, they were destroyed by Peter Baring, an aristocrat who believed he was too gentlemanly to meddle in the grubby details of oversight. Both men, separated by 100 years, embodied the same fatal Baring flaw, a profound aristocratic detachment that mistook incompetence for superiority. They were the 6th great power of Europe, a dynasty that had financed wars and built nations. And in the end, that 233-year-old legacy was annihilated, not by a rival empire or a market crash, but by its own culture and a 28-year-old working-class trader in a back office pushing send on a keyboard.